All right, so again, we're talking about the early Middle Ages coming up, and we have been just doing a little summary, a little overview of the early Middle Ages, which really, even though I probably should correct this slide, I would make it earlier than 500. Let's make it more like 300, roughly. At any rate, we said there were small towns, very little travel. There's going to be a lot of invasions that are going to bring new people in. And one of the differences between, say, the Roman era is the Germanic culture. Those Germanic tribes, those people that lived north of Rome, have their own culture, and that is going to greatly affect the history of the Middle East, history of the Middle Ages, and the kind of government and culture that they have. All right, let's move on. With all the invasions that are coming, including the Vikings, which I know a lot of you like the Vikings, so we're going to have some special time with our friends the Vikings. It made life... What?
Have you ever seen the show Vikings?
Well, I've seen a lot of shows about Vikings. You're talking about the television show?
Yeah.
Yeah, I've seen it. Have you seen the old movie from the 1960s on Vikings? I may make that one of the things you're to watch, because they have a nice view of longships. Well, everybody, it seems like we're still missing something here. Pass this around some more. Everybody needs 2 chapters. 2 chapters out of that. Yeah, 2. Uh-huh. How many?
There's 21, 22 chapters.
Yeah.
There's 8 of us.
Yeah, that's 16. Yeah, it'll make it. It'll make it. Yeah, it'll work. It'll work. Yeah, there's 8 of you, and there's 21 chapters. So if you each do 2, that's 16. That still leaves 5.
The Kirk Douglas Vikings movie?
Yes!
1958?
Oh, you just looked it up.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's excellent. I'll probably have you watch at least an excerpt of that. I mean, it would be nice maybe have you watch the whole, if I can find it for free somewhere, have you watch the whole thing. But
It's Kirk Douglas.
it's Kirk Douglas. It's an excellent film. And actually, I recently watched it, but I have access to the DVD. I can still get DVDs from Netflix. I know it's very antiquated now, but there's a lot more selection if you have the DVDs plus the streaming, because streaming doesn't always have a lot of stuff I want to see. Anyway, so I recently watched it as I've been preparing for class, and over the summer. Over the past summer, I actually worked at a camp, kind of like a Russian gulag, but it was for kids. And I taught courses, or whatever, I don't know, whatever they were called, classes. One of them on Vikings, the other one on archaeology. And so I have some things I'll share with you that maybe a song or 2 that I used to play for them. But I used a clip from that to show the longboats, because they have a nice view of that. So I got the movie in August, I guess it was, and watched it, and it had the like little extras on it because it's the DVD, and it had a little bit of the background talking to the director and all that sort of thing. So they actually tried to make the film as authentic as they could, as far as the longboats and things like that. But at any rate, the invasions are going to stir things up. But life for people was fairly consistent, you know. For a lot of people, especially if they're not wealthy, sometimes it doesn't matter all that much who's in charge. You know, I'm a farmer, I keep farming. The next guy takes over, he's still going to need food. He's going to want me to farm. So, but by 1,000, most all the invaders, the people who had come to invade, have actually settled. One of the things that a lot of people don't know about Vikings is that Vikings are actually farmers. They did a lot of farming. And part of what they were doing was expanding their territory and looking for better farmland. So once they invaded and settled, they became farmers, a lot of them, and sort of blended. There was kind of a blending into the culture that way. Okay. The only formal institution of this early medieval period was the church, and we've mentioned this before. Because governments, they're not centralized governments. They're local, they're regional, maybe a duke, something like that, but a lot of it's on a village or manor. But the church was the one formal institution that was, all across Europe. There was only one church. Now, there were some small groups that were labeled heretical and that sort of thing. But what I'm saying is the organization of the church, which we would probably call the Roman Catholic Church, was the one big formal institution you have during the early medieval period. And all the clergy were tied to it. Yes?
Since the Vikings were invaders and they have a reputation of pillaging villages and stuff like that, does that mean they were kind of like the terrorists of their day?
The terrorists of their...
No.
Well, I suppose they terrorized people, but they had, they were plundering. They were trying to take gold. They were trying to take things that they thought were of value. The places where the value was...
Like bank robbery for them, because monasteries had a crap ton of gold and stuff, so yeah.
Yeah, the places where they find the most valuable stuff and the easiest to get were monasteries, churches, that sort of thing. Because, if they could sail upriver to the center of a town, they got this giant building, it's the biggest building in town, a cathedral. They go into the cathedral, here's gold, golden lampsticks, and there's gold-covered Bibles with maybe jewels on it. That's all pretty easy stuff then to carry. So they were carrying away loot, basically. And, sometimes they would kidnap people as well, hold them for ransom, that sort of thing. So, yeah, there were more raids like that. Now, there were some where they actually wanted the land, and that will come later too. Especially in England, they settle and begin to farm. So, because, the word Viking itself is just talking about those who raid. The Norsemen, or the men of the north, was a broader group than just the Vikings. They weren't all what we might technically call Vikings. So the Vikings is not the name of the people. The Viking is the name of a group of Norsemen who went on raids, and they went Vikings. They were Vikings because they were raiding. So we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves there, but that you are right. You're right. They certainly did terrorize people. But it wasn't really, depends on how you define terrorism. It was not a sort of political... The terrorists of today come and terrorize with a political aim. They're wanting to just strike fear and make some kind of political... The Vikings were not that interested in that. They were interested in loot, primarily. The ones that went out like that. Stuff that they could haul back to their boats and take back with them. And so buildings, no, we don't care about buildings. Gold, silver, gemstones, jewelry, maybe some people that we think we could trade for more gold and stuff. Yeah. Well, anyway, all the clergy is tied to the hierarchy of the church. And the church has this hierarchy with the Bishop of Rome, who comes to be known as and called the Pope. So you had this real top-down organization in the church where you had the Pope, College of Cardinals, the bishops, and so forth, right on down to the local parish priests. And so there was a real network there. There was a network of organization. And that was the most organized thing of the early Middle Ages, was the church. It had offices, if you will. It had representatives in basically every village. There was a priest. a church building. In larger cities, they had the bishop and cathedrals, and they were collecting money from people. People were giving them money that was going through the central organization. They were making decisions at the top that were sort of carried out all the way down through. They used the centralized language of Europe, which was Latin, and they educated people in Latin, the priests and so forth, the monks. So this was really there. Now, it wasn't completely controlled by Rome. I mean, obviously the Pope had a great influence, but there was a lot of local influence as well. The local bishop, and the local bishop normally had contacts with the local nobility, like the dukes or the earls and things like that. There was also something called secular clergy. So if we're talking about the medieval period, you have to know that there's sort of two groups of clergy. Regular clergy is usually what they're called, and secular clergy. Now that seems kind of strange to our ear, because when we use the word secular today, we mean something that has nothing to do with the church, right? At least when I hear people talk, they say, well, this is secular, and then this is Christian or religious. So we have sort of two categories. If it's religious or Christian, that's here. If it's secular or of the world, it's here. But in the medieval period, when you use the word or the term secular clergy, you don't mean that the clergy is worldly. You mean that this is the clergy that would actually work with people of the world. The regular clergy only works with the church. So, for example, a monk does not have regular duties with regular people because they live in a monastery. They work in a monastery. I mean, it occasionally may interact with people, but that's not their mission. For most monks, is not dealing with local people. It's not like a parish priest. A parish priest deals with people all the time. A parish priest speaks to them, gives communion to them, will counsel them, will do weddings for them, baptisms. So they're working with people all the time. That's their job. They are secular clergy because they're the clergy that works with the secular world outside the church, outside the umbrella of clergy. Does that make sense? So remember then, that's what when you read that word, that's what they mean. Don't be confused. The secular clergy then get a lot of support from the local people because as there are troubles with the church, maybe some local people don't like what the bishop is wanting to do. Don't like some of the policies or whatever. Doesn't understand why Rome is doing certain things or the bishop is doing certain things. But you know what? Most of them like their local parish priest. Why? Because their local parish priest, they know. Their local parish priest is the guy who comes and prays for them when they're sick. He's the guy that comes and christens their babies and performs the weddings and things like that. So they have a relationship with the local parish priest that they don't have with the bishop or the cardinals or the pope, certainly. So there is a lot of influence of the church there, but that also means that sometimes the local parish priest is not going to do exactly what the bishop or the pope might say because he knows this is not what the people really need or what they want. Okay, so anyway, that's a dynamic that's there that we need to remember. Now, remember the clergy will often be involved. I think as we mentioned last time, remember we talked about clerical work and a cleric. So clergy, the word clergy and the word cleric and the word clerical are all from the same root word. But the main reason that the clergy gets involved with clerical work, what we might call office work, book work, some people call it, that sort of thing, is because they're the ones that can read. and write. And we talked about that last time, that this is a skill that even well-educated people didn't know how to write. They probably could read. Writing was more difficult. And so clergy were employed by the king, by the duke, and so forth, to keep records, to manage records. Governments really need records. For example, as I told you last time, governments don't just create money, governments tax people and get their wealth. Then they take that wealth and they use it to run the government and they use it to do other things. But for me to be able to, if I'm the guy running the government, for me to be able to know how much I can tax you, I need to know how much you have. That's what's called the census. We're going to have a census coming up, I guess in 2 years. They'll probably be, maybe next year, start to ramp it up anyway. But the 2020 census will be coming up, right? This is 2018, so. What is a census all about? A census is all about not just counting the people, but figuring out what they own and figuring out new ways that we can tax them. And believe me, there's some ways they haven't yet done that they could do. Sometimes they threaten to do. But the bottom line is I have to know how many people there are and where they live and how much they have so that I can figure out how much I can get from them. And then secondly, I have to know that once I have said you're going to have to pay this amount of money or whatever, have you actually paid it? If I just went around to all of you and said, well, each one of you have to give me $100, and then, I have no, maybe a couple of you give it to me, but I don't know who paid me and who didn't pay me. It's hard for me to then say, well, I know 3 or 4 people paid me, but 5 or 6 did not pay me, and which ones were they? And without the records, of course, here it's a small group, but the larger the group is, the harder it's going to be to keep track of that. You have to have records to keep track of who's paid and how much did they pay and when did they pay. Okay, so that you know who to go lean on to get your money. It's for taxes. So, same with governments. In medieval times, they have to collect the taxes. The other thing is they have to enact decrees or laws. If they say, you must do this or you can't do this, they have to convey that message to people so that they actually know that they're not supposed to do it or what they are supposed to do. So to do that, if I'm in a central, let's say I'm a king and I'm living in a central location, like let's say Tallahassee, I'm the king of Florida, how am I going to let people know in Lakeland what I've decided? Well, today, of course, we got all kinds of electronic stuff, but back then they did not. So that means you'd have to have it written down. Then you'd have to share it regionally, and then they would have to share it. All that involves writing it down, transmitting it, and then have somebody read it on the other end and transmit it. So that involves clerical work. Okay. So the other thing we need to remember is that the real basis of power in the medieval world is land. It's land. I mean, it's not so much that today. I mean, land is still very valuable today. Don't get me wrong. Real estate's very important. However, it's not the only thing. It's not the central. It was really in the medieval world. It was just land. Land was it, because there's not really cash. You don't really have banks in the way we have them today and loans and all that kind of stuff. Really, if you owned land, you had wealth, because the land was the means to producing what everybody needed. People needed to eat. People still need to eat. The only way you're going to do that is by land. You raise crops, you raise animals. It takes land to do that. Okay? Not going to grow, if you got a little one room apartment, you're not going to grow much wheat in there, right? You got to have fields. You can keep a few goats in there maybe, but
Like I said, weed, I was like, no.
what?
It sounded like you said weed.
I honestly thought you said you were growing wheat in your apartment.
Now, see, I think this all says more about you than me.
There's sorry.
Well, I know, but it's just where your mind goes. It's what the psychologists would say. It's just. It's like when they send me to the psychologist, as they often do, and he shows me these pictures, and then I tell him what they are, and then he looks shocked as he writes the stuff down. I say, look, you're the guy with the dirty pictures. I didn't lock you in my office and show you dirty pictures. That'd be against the law. But I go to your office, and suddenly I'm the bad guy because you're the one showing me the. No, never mind. That was just a joke. Obviously not a good one. All right. Power comes from land. That's what I'm trying to tell you. If you're going to grow crops, you need land. If you're going to raise animals like sheep and goats and things like that, cows and pigs, you need some land. Land is wealth. Land is power. Land is status. And so then what happens is your relationship to the land is what becomes critical to your relationship and status in society. So we can really boil it down to the land. Do you own the land or do you have control over land? And then how? How are you connected to the land? That really explains who you are in the medieval world. If you own it, you're nobility, right? If you own it or manage it, you are nobility. If you're just working on it, then you're a peasant. So, I think I've got a little diagram here. Let's see if the this is called feudalism, or the feudal system, or the feudal hierarchy, right? You see that there? Yeah, there we go. And it's kind of like a pyramid. I know you guys are involved in a lot of pyramid schemes. Trying to make money to pay for your tuition or whatever. You're selling your Amway, your Mary Kay. You guys are probably big Mary Kay salesmen, or whatever. You got a pink Cadillacs out there. I've seen them. But basically, it's kind of I guess I should call it a pyramid scheme. I don't want to be sued, but it is a pyramid style of organization, right? You got Mary Kay or whoever at the top, George Amway. I don't know what his name is, and then they got all of it, and then they divide it out to people. And then, for example, I say, okay, you're gonna now be. I'm gonna deliver you the material. Now you go and find 5 guys to deliver the material to. I find 5 guys that then find 5 other guys. Now I got 25 guys who are getting stuff from me, and those 25 guys go 4 guys. So suddenly I am distributing stuff to a lot of people, and I get a cut of all of that. That's really how this works, right?
Pyramid scheme.
I don't want to call it a scheme. It's a pyramidal organization. Yeah, they have other names for it, but that's really what it is. Well, feudalism is somewhat like that, okay? It is pyramidal. It is top down. So you have the person who actually owns the land. That's the king. So let's say it's the king of Florida, right? The king of Florida's got that's a lot of land. So that's too much for the king to really personally oversee closely. So what the king does then is divides that into, let's call them counties, right? I don't know how many counties Florida has, but I would say over 100, right? Let's say 100 just for fun. So there's 100 counties that he divides his land up into 100 pieces. Then he goes out and he identifies nobility that he is going to let them supervise that land for him. I still owe the land, but you guys supervise it, and you pretty much treat it like it's your land, although you ultimately have to recognize it's mine. All right? So let's say we divide it up to these 50 or 100 people that are doing that. Then what they do, of course, now they got a big chunk. Some of these counties are pretty big. They subdivide it, all right, from a duchy, from a duke to a count, and right on down the line. Now, in turn then, if you are nobility, this gives you a source of income. Because now this piece of land, let's say it's 5,000 acres of land or whatever it is going to produce you some revenue, because everybody who's farming that land is going to be giving you a cut. In turn, you're going to give a cut to the guy above you, and they're going to give a cut to the guy above them, and they're going to give a cut to the king. See how that works? So it's like a pyramid. It's going right up the line. Now, why is it done that way? Because the king, there's a low population. The king needs certain things. Management of the land, it's too much for one person to manage in detail, that it needs to be managed. But also, the king also needs soldiers. The king needs an army. And you don't have enough people living in the land to have a standing army. A standing army is extremely expensive. Even the United States now doesn't have the kind of standing army that they once had, and they've reorganized it. It's smaller. I think they would probably call it leaner and meaner, but at any rate, it's smaller and cheaper. Because having a standing army, let's say, or military, and to have those people, and that's all they do is military, that's it. That means you pull them completely out of the workforce and they're just soldiers. Who's going to raise the food? Who's going to do all the other jobs that need to be done while these guys sit around and wait for a war or whatever, doing maneuvers, going through the training? It's costly. And in medieval world, they did not have the population to be able to do that. They didn't have the resources to do that. So, in fact, the feudal system is a way to create an army, a military, when you need it. And when you don't need it, you don't have to feed it or worry about it or house it. They're doing that themselves. Okay? So what that means then is the king would say to the duke, all right, Duke, I'm giving you this big chunk of land. Here's the deal, though. You're going to give me revenue from that land. And you're going to take an oath of loyalty that says, I'm your king. You're loyal to me. You recognize this is my land. And you are my duke. And you're going to commit to service. So in other words, if I turn around in a month and I go to my dukes, however many I have, 10 of the dukes, and I say, Dukes, I need an army, and I need it now. I want you to assemble all the men on Friday, and we're going into battle. Then that's your job as the duke to assemble people, to go to your counts and say, okay, we need the men, then the counts go to their people, and we can then assemble hundreds of soldiers, hundreds of people to fight, many of them on horseback, and we can do that in a pretty rapid fashion within a few days. And then they have so many sort of days of service a year that you'd be expected to do that. So you see how that works? The feudal system then is a give and take. But the basis of it all is land. Land is the wealth, because land produces food. Gives a place people to live, to raise animals, to raise crops. I would say wheat, but some people think that's something else. Sometimes, I think drugs affect the hearing. Anyway, so the lords sort of dole out the land to others. Those are called vassals. A vassal. And there's a lord and vassal. The vassals then protect the lord, and the castle, and so forth, if it was attacked. And then each person had to take an oath, all the way down the line, had to take an oath of loyalty to the king. All the way down to like the regular soldier has to be loyal to the king, take an oath of loyalty to the king. And of course, loyalty to the guy who's above him. So I'm loyal to the king and I'm loyal to the count. And I'm loyal to the king and I'm loyal to the duke. I'm loyal to the duke, So you go right down the line. Does that make sense? All right, good. So the hierarchy then is we have nobility, we have peasants, that's everybody who's not noble, but within the peasants we have another group that are often called a serf. You see it down here at the bottom. Not like you guys do, riding a serf on your surfboards, but this is with an E, S-E-R-F, serf, not S-U-R-F, serf, okay? So the serf then is someone who is not, I suppose, technically a slave, but pretty close to that situation. They are tied to the land. Remember, land is everything. You got to be able to work the land. So basically, I've got a piece of land. There are people basically assigned that are farming that land. They're going to go out and plow it, plant it, harvest it. And even if I somehow lose the land and it goes to somebody else, you're still assigned to that land. Even if the land gets reassigned. Maybe a different count takes it over. It doesn't matter. You stay with the land. You're going to stay with the land your whole life. And typically your children are going to stay working the land after you, and so on. So this is a kind of, it's not technically slavery because the person is not owned directly. The land is owned and the person is attached to the land permanently. So, how's that different than slavery? There's subtle differences, I guess. It is technically different. But as far as what your life is, you're not free to say, hey, I'm just going to pack up and leave. Or I just don't want to do this anymore. No, this is your job. This is what you're doing. All right?
What happens to a serf who runs away or says, I'm
Yeah. Well, that'd be good to research, but I don't think it happens too often because you really don't have any resources to run away, and where are you going to run away to? But if they did kind of become rogue or disobedient, they would be punished, I suppose ultimately executed if they were too, disagreeable. Disciplined, definitely, in various ways. For example, the lord of the manor. So, this land gets divided right down to manors. And manors are sort of estates of sizable states of land that farmers then work. The lord of the manor not only has control of the land, but of all the crops. So the guy who's working the fields, let's say you're the guy who's working the fields, you would owe the lord of the manor a big chunk of your crop. You would get to keep part of it for yourself. That would be for you and your family to eat. Maybe a part of that you could trade for things that you couldn't, commodities or tools or something that you couldn't make yourself. But then when you have, let's say, the wheat that you were going to make into bread, to do that you have to grind it. It has to be done at a mill. Across the medieval land of Europe, it was illegal to have your own mill or millstone. So in other words, I couldn't take the wheat that was even a part of the part. I gave my part to the Lord. These bushels or whatever are mine, and it have a stone here, and I grind it myself, and then I take that flour and mix it with water or whatever, and I make bread, or my wife makes bread. That's illegal. Why? You have to take it to the miller. The miller works for the manor. The lord of the manor controls the mill. and he also then gets a percentage of your flour when it's ground. So he you know, I don't know what, let me just guess at the percentage. Let's say he gets half, a third, maybe at least a third of what you raise, he gets. Then when you take your third in you want to be flour, he gets another probably a third of that as flour, as another sort of mill tax. So if you try to avoid that by having your own little millstone and they find out about it, you'll be punished for that as well. They'll break it, they'll take the stone away from you. You will have probably physical harm as well as perhaps taking some of your crop away from you that they say is owed to the Lord. This also then relates to the animals. The animals all belong to the Lord. So this includes large animals, like let's say in Europe, a deer, rabbits, game birds. So you decide, hey, I'm going to supplement my food by going out here hunting, right? I'm going to trap a rabbit or shoot it with an arrow or something, and I'm going to have some rabbit stew. Sorry, you can't do that. All the animals belong to the Lord. If you are found doing that, you are a poacher. You would be punished. So I'm just trying to give you a window into how this works. The land and everything on it belongs to the Lord. You are someone who's working a piece of that and raising crops. For that, you get a share of that crop. You don't get a share of the other stuff. Now, the Lord may grant certain times to say, okay, you can go hunt small things like rabbits on certain days, because I'm a nice guy. Probably never large game like deer, venison. You would never probably ever have. Okay? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So this is how they would control it. I mean, you are very controlled. Even a free peasant is very controlled, but a serf even more so. So there's two kind of peasants. There's free peasants and there's serf. And then the free peasants would sometimes go into trades. They'll become a blacksmith or a baker or a miller. They'd work in the Lord's mill, grinding grain, stuff like that. Woo! All right. It seems like we got another. Yeah, so here is the hierarchy of medieval society. And this is probably, since we're running out of time, it's probably the last thing we'll talk about today. But this is very important to remember that there is a hierarchy of medieval society. Basically, you got the nobility, and then you got the peasants. Those are two big groups. But within the nobility, you have the clergy, the upper clergy, and then the non-clergy, the noblemen. So the big wheels in the church are clergy. Clergy are at the top of society. Again, if we're drawing it like a triangle or a pyramid, at the very top, there's not a lot of clergy, because remember, in a medieval society, in all pre-modern societies, about 90% of all the people would be classified as peasants. Let's just say nothing. We'll say 90, roughly 90%, are peasants. These are people who are working. They actually work, physically work. I know, how terrible. I mean, they go out and work in the fields. They take care of animals. They maybe weave cloth. They sew things. Whatever they're doing is physical labor. 90% of the people are doing that. 10% are not, roughly. Out of that 10%, probably about 3% are clergy. Clergy then have a special status because they're clergy. They're kind of out of some of the politics because technically clergy aren't supposed to have any children. So they can't have any heirs. So that kind of, And then the rest are nobility. So basically this gets defined in three ways. A very simple way to remember medieval society. Those who pray, those who fight, and those who work. Those who pray, clergy. Those who fight, nobility. Those that work, peasants. And nobility felt work was beneath them. It's not what we do. That's what peasants do. Our work, if you want to call it that, is fighting. It's running things, managing everything, telling other people what to do, and fighting. That's what we do. And then the clergy prays and does all that kind of church stuff, right? So there it is. So that forms the basis of European society, and still in many ways affects it even today. But those are the three big groups: those who pray, those who fight, and those who work. Well, we're out of time once again.